ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು.
ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದಾ? ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಭ್ಯೋ ನಮಃ. ಹರಿ ಓಂ. ನಮೋ ಗುರುಭ್ಯೋ ನಮಃ ಪರಮಗುರುಭ್ಯಃ. ಓಂ ಸಾಕಾರವಾನೇವ ಹಿ ವೇದಧರ್ಮಃ ಸಾರ್ಥವತಿ ತೇನ ಸರಸ್ವತಿ ಚ ಸೌಮ್ಯಃ ಸ ಶಂಕರಧೃತಾವತಾರೋ ಲೋಕೆ ಚ ಕಾಸ್ತಿ ಕಿಲ ಶಂಕರಾರ್ಯಃ. ಓಂ ಕಷಾಯರಹಿತಂ ಕಾಷಾಯವಾಸಂ ಸ್ವರೂಪನಿಷ್ಠಂ ಪರಿಪೂರ್ಣಬೋಧಂ ವಂದೇ ನಿಶಂ ಸಚ್ಚಿದಾನಂದರೂಪಂ ಸರಸ್ವತೀಂ ಇಂದ್ರಸಮಾನತೇಜಂ. Good morning, all of you, and welcome to the special Pravachana Saptaha organized virtually by Krishna Kamala Vedanta Pathashala. The guest speaker of this session, Srimati Manjushri HEGDE, is present before us on the screen, and Krishna Kamala Vedanta Pathashala extends a warm welcome to the renowned speaker. Before starting the program, I would just like to introduce briefly Srimati Manjushri HEGDE to this session. Srimati Manjushri HEGDE is currently pursuing her PhD in Indian philosophy, Advaita Vedanta, at prestigious Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, IIT Madras. She has previously worked as Assistant Professor, Amrita Vishwavidyapitham, Coimbatore. She has presented numerous research papers on prestigious platforms in respect of Shankaradvaitasiddanta and other subjects. She has also published a monograph titled Reclaiming Ramayana. She holds a bachelor degree in mechanical engineering, a master's degree in Sanskrit, and an Acharya degree in Sanskrit Sahitya. She has studied Sanskrit Vyakarana traditionally under the renowned Sanskrit grammarian of this country, Dr. Pushpa Dikshit, and Advaita Vedanta according to Paramapuja Sri Sri Satchidanandendrasarawati School of Thought under Brahmashri Ashwathanarayana Avadhanigal, who was a direct disciple of Sri Sri Satchidanandendrasarawati of Holenarasipura, and now a sannyasi, Pujya Aksharanandendrasarawati. She is currently involved in multiple projects on Indian knowledge systems. Speaker of this session, Srimati Manjushri HEGDE, is present before us, and on behalf of Krishna Kamala Vedanta Pathashala, I once again welcome the renowned speaker, Srimati Manjushri HEGDE, to the session and request the speaker to start the pravachana in English on the subject ShuddaShAnkaraprakriyABhAskaraha, a unique Sanskrit work of Pujya Swami Satchidanandendrasarawati of Holenarasipura. Madam, you can start the program.
ओम नमो ब्रह्मादिभ्यो ब्रह्मविद्या संप्रदाय कर्तृभ्यो वंशर्षिभ्यो नमो महद्भ्यो नमो गुरुभ्यः. Namaste. Very good morning to everybody, And a very heartfelt thank you to the organizers, Murthy sir, for giving me this opportunity to talk about a very important text of Swami Satchidanandendrasarawati, the ShuddaShAnkaraprakriyABhAskaraha. I'll be using a PPT for easy comprehension. So let me share my screen with you.
ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್ ಜೋರು ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು ಮೇಡಮ್. ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್ ಇನ್ಕ್ರೀಸ್ ದಿ ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್.
ಸ್ಕ್ರೀನ್ ಶೇರ್ ಮಾಡಕ್ಕೆ ಆಪ್ಷನ್ ಇಲ್ವಾ?
ಹೌದಾ? ಹಲೋ,
ಆಗ್ಲಿ ಬಿಡಿ, ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಪರವಾಗಿಲ್ವಾ? ಕಾಣಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆಯಾ? I'm sorry. I'll give a brief introduction about the text itself. This text is a condensed version of a 3-volume work. The English version is a condensed version of a 3-volume work originally published in Sanskrit in 1964. In the preface to this text, Swami outlines the purpose of this work. He says this text is intended to provide readers with an outline of his magnum opus, the Vedantasiddanta. The Vedantasiddanta is the crowning achievement of Swami's scholarly pursuits. It is his most significant and comprehensive contribution to the field of Advaita Vedanta. It is the foundational text for much of Swami's scholarly works. Most of his other writings serve as expansions of the central themes that he has expounded upon in this text. The ShuddaShAnkaraprakriyABhAskaraha is essentially the essence of Vedanta Prakriya Pratyabhijna. And it contains a comparative study of all the important Vedantic systems available from the most ancient times. Study like this has immense value because it facilitates a nuanced understanding of the divergent schools of thought within the Advaita Vedanta system. By exploring the various tenets, the epistemologies, the methodologies of these systems, we gain a deeper appreciation of the complexities inherent in each. We are better equipped to contextualize, to critically evaluate their claims and ours. A comparative study like this can engender a comprehensive and a sophisticated understanding of Advaita Vedanta. Swami has often been accused of excessively criticizing other schools of Vedanta, not merely the Dvaita traditions, but also the traditional commentators of Shankara Bhashya, the Vyakyanakaras. But is this true? Did Swami merely criticize the Vyakyanakaras? And was it criticism for the sake of criticism? Was it lack of Shraddha that drove Swami to refute their positions? No, not at all. To merely criticize the tradition was not Swami's intention at all. Swami's primary concern was the fact that there existed a bewildering number of differences of opinion amongst the Vyakyanakaras, the different commentators of the same Shankara Bhashya. The vast array of conflicting opinions of the Vyakhyanakaras is very, very confusing for a true sadhaka, for a sincere seeker, for a true student of Vedanta. There are questions that plague a genuine sadhaka. Questions like, is there one authentic system of Vedanta contained in the Upanishads? Is there a unity of teaching in the Prasthanatraya? How do we understand whose opinion is right, whose is wrong? Which commentator can we rely on, and based on what criteria do we rely on them? These are the questions that confront every genuine sadhaka. Swami's critiques were motivated by a genuine desire to clarify and consolidate the teachings of Vedanta for the benefit of sincere speakers. Now, you can argue that there is no single method of interpretation. There are scholars who argue like this. They argue that the various conflicting opinions found within the commentaries are not defects, that they are teachings intended for different sadhakas of different intellectual levels. The idea that one method is the right one and all the rest are to be rejected is misguided, is their opinion. Where is the rule that states that a person can attain Brahmajnana through only one specific method? Appaya Dikshita says, Akalpita Vastu Pratipat, I forget this, is a very beautiful sentence, as in very apt, precise sentence that he says, Akalpita Vastu Pratipatti Upayat. I forget, but he says the virodho na doshavaha is what his sentence is. Yatha tatvika arundhati pratipatyupayataya nana purushaihi kalpyamanannu tat prajyodichyadi nakshatra rupasu sthularundhateshu virodho na doshavaha. If Arundhati is pointed out by different individuals from different directions, north and south, their descriptions may vary, but they point to the same Arundhati Nakshatra. So the differences don't matter. This is the type of reasoning that is given by many scholars today. But is this true? Swami staunchly refuted this. No. We need to look no further than Shankara Bhashya for evidence. Did Shankaracharya also simply dismiss the differing theoretical positions by asserting that they all ultimately espoused Advaita and then leave the matter at that? No. He explicated his own methodology, bolstered by citations from the Vedas and persuasive logical argumentation, while concurrently rejecting the approaches of other philosophers as inadequate for establishing Advaita. He refuted Ashmarathya's position. He refuted Audulomi's position, Bharata Prapancha's position. He refuted the Prasankhyanavadin. He did not simply say, bhave pumsam vipatti pratyagatmani. This is Sureshwaracharya's Vakya, and Swami discusses this quotation of Sureshwaracharya's and shows how it has been misinterpreted. Sureshwaracharya did not mean let the differences in opinions remain, that every opinion, every path is valid. No. A big part of his Brihadaranyaka Bhashya Vartika is dedicated to refuting opposing theories. The full part of the Naishkarmya Siddhi is just refutation of the Purva Bhaksha. According to Swamiji and Shankaracharya and Sureshwaracharya, amidst the various theories that are at odds with one another, it is only plausible that a sole accurate pathway exists. Paths leading in opposite directions cannot converge at the same destination. There cannot be multiple accurate interpretations of a given reality. In the Mahabharata, it is said that the path which leads to the eastern sea cannot possibly lead to the western sea. In the light of these different views, The investigation aimed at recognition of the right method of Vedanta cannot be seen as a kind of arbitrary pastime. Swami is not simply selecting one particular constellation from the countless stars. No. Swami's refutation of other positions should be understood in the context of his efforts to reconcile the many conflicting opinions and interpretations of the Upanishads. His approach is aimed at establishing a coherent, systematic understanding of Vedanta that is grounded in the classical texts and traditions, in the true original sampradaya of Gaudapadacharya, Shankaracharya, and Sureshwaracharya. Ultimately, the value of Swami's approach to Vedanta should be assessed based on its ability to illuminate the wisdom contained in these works. And in this, he has achieved supreme success. He has achieved precisely this. He has established that one true method of Vedanta. You read Swami's works, you don't need to look anywhere else for clarification of Vedanta. And to this, we must be eternally grateful to him. Ashtanga pranama to him. Another doubt that may arise is it worthwhile for a sadhaka to understand Purva Paksha? Is it not enough to understand the Siddhanta well? See, I do think it is very important to understand the Purva Paksha, not to debate with anyone or to criticize anyone, but because the Purva Paksha is primarily the very real questions, the very real doubts and confusions that occur within us. The Purva Pakshi is not necessarily out there. He is in here. I know this from my experience. The questions that came to me, the very real debates that happen inside my head, these are the questions that I read here as Purva Paksha. And even when the Purva Paksha genuinely refers to a proponent of a different philosophical school, or even someone who offers a different interpretation within this same school of philosophy, we have to remember that this Purva Pakshi is no fool. Was Vachaspati Mishra a fool? Was Swami Vidyaranya not intelligent? These are intellectual giants. And if they were convinced about a certain point of discussion, if their very sharp intellect found certain arguments convincing, you have to understand that point, understand why it is that they found it convincing, and see if you have the answer for it. And if your answer is convincing to you. This is how philosophy is done. So a comprehensive study of the Purva Paksha helps to understand the Siddhanta better. And Swami says this in so many words. Samalotanasya phalam tu bhashyakara sampradayanavata prakriyayaha vaishishtya buddhi dhardhyarthameva. So this text is a very, very useful compendium that will truly help the sadhaka. I'm sorry. There is one. It is organized into 7 distinct chapters. We will devote each day of this discourse to an in-depth exploration of each chapter. This will allow us to effectively delve into each topic with the necessary degree of thoroughness. Wherever possible, I will try to incorporate the relevant points from the Vedanta Prakriyabhaskarah into our discussions. Very quickly, the topic of discussion each day is given. So today we will discuss the first chapter, which is titled Vedantasiddanta Nirnayaha. It primarily deals with Pre-Shankara Advaita. I will just a second. Let me briefly contextualize this work. This text is a very distinct contribution to academia. In the academic discourse of Swami's time, in academia today, the question of existence of various Vedantic schools prior to Shankaracharya his affiliation with a specific traditional school of Vedanta. This is a topic of much contention. Let me read you a quotation from Swami's work. This is a very long quotation. Please bear with me. Swami writes, Professor Radhakrishnan's estimate of Shankara is that he tried to bring back the age of the brilliant luxury of the Puranas to the mystic truth of the Upanishads. Besides Gaudapada, the only predecessors of Shankara mentioned by the professor are Bhartrhari and Bhartaprapancha. Dr. Dasgupta writes, I do not know of any Hindu writer previous to Gaudapada who attempted to give an exposition of the monistic doctrine either by writing a commentary as did Shankara or by writing an independent work as did Gaudapada. Dr. Thibaut remarks, Shankara does not, on the whole, impress one as an author particularly anxious to strengthen his own case by appeals to the ancient authorities. And this implies perhaps that Shankara had no traditional line of previous teachers worth mentioning. Dr. Thibaut questions Ghosh's position when the latter maintains that Shankara is the generally recognized expositor of the true Vedantic doctrine, that doctrine was handed down by an unbroken series of teachers intervening between him and the Sutrakara, and that there existed from the beginning only one Vedanta doctrine, agreeing in all essential points with the doctrine known to us from Shankara's writings. Dr. Thibaut believes that, on the other hand, that Ramanuja's system rests on an old and weighty tradition. Both Thibaut and Dasgupta are of the opinion that the Vrittikara criticized by Shankara is Bodhayana. Dr. T.R.V. Murthy, however, admits that there were monistic schools of Vedanta before Gaudapada and Shankara, though he surmises that the latter two reformulated the Upanishadic ideal in the light of Madhyamaka and Vijnanavada dialectic. Dr. T.M.P. Mahadevan, the editor and translator of Sambandhavartika of Sureshwara, stands alone among modern scholars in recognizing some Vedantic monistic schools opposed to Shankara's. Anyone who goes through the Vartika cannot but take cognizance of these schools, since the very subject matter of the work is a criticism of different views with regard to the teaching of the Upanishads. But as the editor was discussing only the relation between the two kandas of the Veda according to Shankara and Sureshwara, perhaps he failed to notice what exactly was the difference in outlook between Shankara and his opponents, and hence passed by the important question of the existence or non-existence of Shankara's tradition before Gaudapada. Nor has he considered the equally important question of the existence or non-existence of non-Advaita Vedantins during the time of or even antecedent to Shankara. So this was the state of affairs at Swami's time. Very few scholars recognized the traditional lineage of Shankaracharya. They questioned the very existence of such a lineage. They questioned if there existed previous teachers of Advaita Vedanta. They credited Gaudapada's ideas to Buddhist influences. They did not recognize the existence of other Advaita Vedanta expositions and believed that Ramanuja's tradition was older than Shankaracharya's, etc., etc. Today, we are certainly in a better position to evaluate the history of Advaita Vedanta tradition, of teachers before Shankaracharya, before Gaudapadacharya, of ideas contradictory to and supporting Shankara's. And all of this is mostly because of Swami's works, of Swami's exhaustive research, his exhaustive contributions, his tireless efforts to draw attention to this largely ignored topic in academia. So in today's discourse and tomorrow's, we will examine Pre-Shankara Vedanta. Now, in contemporary discourse on Vedanta, it has become necessary to acknowledge the existence of a variety of Vedantic schools like Bheda Bheda, Swabhavika Bheda Bheda, Achintya Bheda Bheda, Advaita, Vishishtadvaita, Advaita, Shuddhadvaita. So many different schools, so many different interpretations of the Upanishads. These schools, which have emerged at different times and under different philosophical influences, make it difficult to determine the authentic interpretation of the Upanishads. An intriguing inquiry that arises in this context pertains to the nature of Vedanta during the period of Shankara and prior to his time. A very pertinent question is, did these systems exist at the time of Shankara, at the time of Badarayana? Can we trace the genealogy of Vedantic philosophy from the epoch of the Upanishads? In this chapter and the next, Swami delineates pre-Shankara Vedantic schools. Inquiry into pre-Shankara Vedantins from a historical perspective yields two advantages. Firstly, it enables us to acknowledge that the doctrines expounded by Shankaracharya were part of a long established tradition that predated his own era. It dispels the notion that he conceived of original ideas. Shankara's teachings were not a product of his own innovation, but rather emerged from an existing tradition. Secondly, it will help us to differentiate between the authentic Advaita Vedanta teachings and those that may have been introduced later through the gradual infiltration of extraneous concepts. So in this chapter, in the first chapter, Swami delves into the realm of Pre-Shankara Purvapaksha Vedanta, which encompasses the various philosophical strands of Vedanta that were subjected to critical scrutiny by Badarayana and Shankaracharya. So today, in today's discussion, our focus will be directed towards pre-Shankara Purvapaksha Vedanta, the various schools of Vedantic philosophy, not Sankhya, Nyaya, Bauddha, etc., but Vedanta, the Purvapaksha Vedanta, which were subjected to critical scrutiny by the revered Badarayana and Shankaracharya. In the next chapter, we will delve into the Advaita tradition of which Shankaracharya was a prominent adherent. We will meticulously scrutinize the illustrious lineage of teachers whose profound teachings were advanced by Shankara. To begin with, it is very apparent that Badarayana's Brahma Sutra comes in a line of an already established tradition. In this text, 7 other Vedic exegetic traditions are quoted by name: Badari, Kashakritsna, Karshnajini, Audulomi, Atreya, Ashmarathya, and Jaimini. Of these 7 names, Swami discusses 3 in this chapter: Audulomi, Ashmarathya, and Kashakritsna. While these names are mentioned in multiple sutras of the Brahma Sutra, they occur together in an adhikarana called the Vakyanvaya Adhikarana, the Brahma Sutra 1.4.19 to 22. This adhikarana, the Vakyanvaya Adhikarana, occurs in the first chapter of the Brahma Sutras, which is called Samanvaya. We know that the 4 chapters of the Brahma Sutras are respectively called Samanvaya, Avirodha, that is non-contradiction, Sadhana, that is the means to the attainment of Brahman, and Phala, the fruition, the result. Samanvaya, we know, denotes reconciliation, correlation, a synchronization of the pronouncements of Shruti on Brahman. The goal of this chapter is to show that all Upanishads teach one harmonious philosophy presented in a regular succession of passages without any contradiction. The Upanishads are the basis of Vedanta philosophy, so it is very necessary to prove that there are no inconsistencies in the Upanishadic textual corpus. The establishment of such an absence of contradiction provides a strong foundation for the entire Vedantic enterprise. And the fact that 1/4 of the whole text is dedicated to Samanvaya shows how important it is. This Adhikarana, the Vakyanvaya Adhikarana, consists of 4 sutras or 3 sutras, discusses the famous Maitreyi Brahmana of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. These sutras are particularly interesting because they are citations of 3 older authority figures. What we have here is perhaps the oldest preserved interpretation of a passage from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Maitreyi Brahmanasta Vakyartha Nirnayaya Pravrittam Tad Idam Sutratrayam. This Maitreyi Brahmana begins with Nava are patyuh kamaya patih priyo bhavati atmanastu kamaya patih priyo bhavati Nava sarvasya kamaya sarvam priyam bhavati atmanastu kamaya sarvam priyam bhavati, and ends with Atmano vare darshanena shravanena matya vijnanenedam sarvam viditam iti priyasansuchitena bhoktratmana upakramya atmani vijnate sarvamedam vijnatam bhavati iti paramatmopadeshaha kritaha. The text initially depicts the individual self, the bhoktra, as the object of the highest affection, atmanastu kamaya sarvam priyam bhavati. But concurrently, it aims to impart knowledge of the supreme self, atmani vijnate sarvamedam vijnatam bhavati. There is an apparent contradiction here and it must be reconciled. And these 3 sutras raise the question of a way of reconciling this Upanishadic passage. And this is a very important information for the early history of Vedanta as a system of Upanishadic exegesis. Tadidam Jivatma Paramatmanor Abhedeno Prakramanam Katham Upapadyatam Ityatra Vipratipanna Ashmarathyalayah. The 3 figures of authority, namely Ashmarathya, Audulomi, Kashakritsna, each present slightly divergent approaches to harmonizing this passage, and this divergence reveals the respective positions on the relation between Jiva and Brahman. We will look at each of their position in turn, discuss Shankaracharya's position also. First, Ashmarathya. Within the Brahma Sutra, Ashmarathya's positions are presented and examined twice. The name Ashmarathya also appears in Apastamba Shrauta Sutra, the Bharadvaja Shrauta Sutra, the Hiranyakesha Grihya Sutras, in the Bharadvaja Parishishta Sutras. And because of this, Ashmarathya is speculated to be a Yajurveda teacher belonging to the Bharadvaja or the Apastamba school. In the Vakyanvayadhikarana, the relevant sutra reads, Pratignya Siddher Lingam Ashmarathyaha. According to the sutra, Ashmarathya posits that the Upanishadic Pratignya, Atmani Vijnate Sarvamidam Vijnatam Bhavati. This is the Upanishadic Pratignya. This Pratignya is itself a linga, an indication that there is an element of similarity, of abhedamsha, between Atman and Brahman. If it were not so, if the Atman and Brahman were absolutely different, then this pratignya could not be fulfilled. Atmani vijnate sarvamedam vijnatam bhavati would be rendered untrue. Therefore, pratignya siddhehe lingam ashmarathyaha. The word linga is the capacity of a word to set forth the meaning. Yattavat chabdasyartham abhidhatum samarthyam tallingam. According to Ashmarathya, the pratignya is itself the linga to assert the abhedamsha between Jiva and Brahman. Shankaracharya writes, Yadi hi vijnanatma paramatmano anyah syate tataha paramatma vijnanepi vijnanatma na vijnayata ityeka vijnanena sarva vijnanam yat pratijnatam tad hiyeta tasmat pratijnasartham vijnanatma paramatmanor abhedamshenopakrammanam ityashmaratya acharyo manyate. The key word, the operative word here is abhedamsha. The abheda is amshena, partly, not fully, not entirely. Swami writes, atra abhedamshenopakrammanam ityukte bhedamshopi abhimata iti gamyate. What this means is, if there is an abhedamsha, then there is a bhedamsha also. So clearly, Ashmaratya was a bheda-bhedavadin. According to bheda-bhedavada, the absolute Brahman and the individual souls are at the same time non-different and different. Shankaracharya writes, Ashmaratyasya tu yadyapi jivasya parasmad ananyatvam अभिप्रेतम तथापि प्रतिज्ञा सिद्धेः इति सापेक्षत्वाभिधानात् कार्यकारणभावः कियानप्यभिप्रेम्यते. Swami translates this as, while Ashmaratya accepts the identity of the individual soul with the higher Atman, it is evident from his saving clause Pratignya Siddhehe, to justify the opening proposition that some kind of cause and effect relation between the individual self and the supreme self is intended. According to Ashmaratya, the relationship between Jiva and Brahma is like the relationship between Karya and Karana. Between a clay pot and clay, there is a difference, there is non-difference, Bheda and Abheda. Jiva Brahma कार्यकारण भावो मृद घटयोरिव घटस्य मृत्सकाशादिव ब्रह्मणः सकाशात् जीवस्य भेदो भेदश्च इत्येतत् आचार्यस्य मतमित्यर्थः. Vachaspati Mishra also uses the analogy of the relationship between fire and sparks of fire issuing from it to illustrate this position of Bheda Bhedavada. So Deeptat Pavakat Visphulingaha Sahasrashaha Prabhavante Sarupaha. So we know that this is Ashmaratya's position. The next Vedantin is that Swami discusses is Audulomi. Audulomi is mentioned in 2 sutras of the Brahma Sutra. Interestingly, the same is also mentioned in Patanjali's Mahabhashya. It is mentioned in Bharadvaja, the Vakyamaya Prakarana. Audulomi's name occurs in the sutra. Utkramishyataha Paramatmanai Kyopapattehe idam abhedenopakrammanam. According to Audulomi, of possessing physical body, the individual jiva stands apart from the supreme self, different to the supreme self as long as it is embodied. However, through daily in meditation, when one acquires lucid knowledge and passes from the mortal frame, that is when one dies, then the jiva attains absolute emanation. The individual self becomes the supreme self. So the term Atma in the Upanishadic passage refers to that individual self which becomes the supreme self when liberated, but stands different from the supreme self when it possesses a body. Shankaracharya writes, Vijnanatma eva dehendriya manobuddhi sanghatopadhi samparkat kalushibhutasya jnana dhyanaadi sadhathanat samasannasya dehadi sangat utkramishya परमात्मनैक्योपपत्तेः पत्तिरिति अभेदेनोपक्रमणम् औडुलोमी आचार्यो मन्यते. So Audulomi's position is up to liberation, which will self and the supreme self are different. But when liberated, there exists no distinction. In liberation, no difference. In transmigration, there is difference. Muktaveva bhedaha samsare bhedeva. This is also Bhaskaracharya's position. He writes, Atyanta bhinnasya jivasya muktyavasthayam abhedapattihi. The absolutely different individual self becomes identical in the state of liberation. So Audulomi teaches Videha Mukti, Jivan Mukti, also the position of Alidantin Brahmadatta. In this sutra, to explain Audulomi's position, Shankaracharya cites Drishtanta from Upanishad, Yathanatyaha, Syandamanaha, Samudrestam Gachanti, Namarupe Vihaya. तथा विद्वान् नाम रूपात् विमुक्तः परात् परं पुरुषम् उपैति दिव्यम्. Just as the rivers giving up name and form flow out and disappear into the ocean, so too the wise released from name and form approach the Purusha higher than even the highest. So the rivers discard their names and forms going into an ocean in the individual selves, discard the name and form and flow into the highest self. So what we find here is that Audulomi was also a Bhedavadin. Swami writes, in the case of Audulomi, both distinction and identity are expressly referred to two different states. So Audulomi's position is slightly different to Ashmaratya's position, yet he advocates Bheda and Abheda between Jiva and Brahma. The last name that Swami discusses in this context is Kashakritsna. In Indian scholar tradition, Kashakritsna is a revered name associated with various fields of study. In addition to being known in grammar, his name is found in the articles of Katyayana, in Patanjali's Mahabhashya, in Helarada's commentary on Vakyapariya. Kashakritsna's name is associated with the Mimamsa school of philosophy. In fact, his school of Mimamsa is called Kashakritsna. Those who study his work are referred to as Kashakritsna. Kashakritsna's name is also mentioned alongside that of Vyasa by Bhatta Bhaskara Mishra. Furthermore, his name appears in Bodhayana's Grihya Sutra, Shrauta Sutra of Katya, highlighting his prominence in the Indian scholarly tradition. In this Adhikarana, his name is mentioned Avasthiteriti Kashakritsnaha. The sutra itself does not tell us very much, but because this sutra is the last sutra in this Adhikarana, the commentators understand it as the Siddhanta Sutra. And because of this, Shankaracharya, Bhaskara, Ramanuja interpret it according to their own metaphysical standpoints. Shankaracharya writes, Asya iva paramatmanon anenapi vijnanatma bhavena avasthanat upapannam idam abhedena upakramanam iti Kashakritsna acharyo manyate. Because this highest self also exists as the conscious self, Vijnanatma, it is possible to begin the conversation. The upakrama is possible, the conversation with Maitreyi, with the statement of non-difference between the highest self and the individual self. Kashakritsna espoused the view that Atman and Brahman are one and the same. The implication here is that from the perspective of empirical reality, the ultimate self takes on the deceptive guise of being the individual self, while from the ultimate perspective, this is not actually the case. This is Shankaracharya's standpoint. Shankaracharya uses his exceedingly important method of the two epistemic standpoints, the Vyavaharika and the Paramarthika, to interpret this Upanishadic passage. From the standpoint of Vyavaharika, Shankaracharya can interpret any and all the Upanishadic passages that do not discuss the non-dual Brahman. For Shankaracharya, all the Upanishadic passages speak of the same Brahman. The only thing is that they communicate it from different standpoints. Here we can see how Shankaracharya's teachings on two epistemic standpoints is essentially an exegetical method of reconciliation of the Upanishadic passages. What we observe is that despite variations in their stances on the relationship between Jiva and Brahman before Mukti, all the three teachers, Ashmaratya, Audulomi, and Kashakritsna, converge on the ultimate identity of Jiva and Brahman in the state of final liberation. In the state of Mukti, Jiva and Brahman are non-different. This is asserted unequivocally by each of the Vedantins. Not one of them holds the absolute distinction between Jiva and Brahman. This assertion of non-difference between Jiva and Brahman in the state of Mukti constitutes the definitive conclusion of this discussion. What we can infer from this is that at the time of Badarayana, there existed no Vedantin who espoused the absolute distinction between Jiva and Paramatma. Swami conclusively demonstrates the conspicuous lack, the absolute absence of any Dvaita interpretation of the Upanishads at the time of Badarayana. Upanishadic Darshana was essentially Advaita. There were many differences in many subtopics, many variations and differences in opinions, but it was consistently maintained that Upanishads ultimately declare Jiva Brahmaikya. No Vipratipatti there. Let us now turn to Shankaracharya's commentary. So far, we looked at the sutras, the Vedantins mentioned explicitly in the Brahma Sutras. We will now look at the different Vedantins that Shankaracharya discussed in his Bhashya. Particularly in Shankara's commentary on Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, there are a number of passages where he introduces Upanishadic interpretations different from his. These most probably originate from older and now lost works. These opinions, Shankaracharya, in almost all cases, treats as objections to which he criticizes. However, he does not specify to whose views he refers to. No names are mentioned. Sureshwaracharya furnishes more information and refers to a great number of different Vedantic traditions in his Vartika, and also the first chapter of the Naishkarmya Siddhi contains a lot of critical analysis of many different strands of Vedanta. Primarily, today we will discuss the Bheda Bhedavada, the Bhagavatas, and the Prasankhyanavadas. We first consider Bhartara Prapancha, a Bheda Bhedavadan. Prapancha must have been a very important exponent of early Vedanta philosophy and an early commentator of the Upanishads. Although none of his work is available anymore, fragmentary records, possible text fragments, paraphrases of his commentary on Brihadaranyaka Upanishad are preserved in Shankaracharya's Brihadaranyaka Upanishad Bhashya, then Sureshwaracharya's Vartika, Anandagiri's Tippani. Aside from Swamiji, who did an extraordinary work in analyzing the available fragments, Professor M. Hiriyanna wrote 2 articles, drew a sketch of his philosophy, identifying it as Bheda Bhedavada. Nakamura also gave a precise picture of his philosophy in his History of Advaita Veda, early Vedanta. Recently, there has been some considerable study in this direction, but their first work was done by Swami in this direction. While Shankaracharya does not mention Bhartara Prapancha's name, his theories are subjected to scathing critiques. In contrast, Sureshwaracharya in his Vartika regularly invokes Bhartara Prapancha by name, cites his commentary as Bhartara Prapancha Bhashya on various occasions, and despite the fact that his doctrines are refuted by both Shankara and Sureshwara, Bhartara Prapancha is regarded as a staunch Brahmavadan. He is held in very high esteem by them. Sureshwaracharya accords him great reverence by using honorifics such as Srimad Bhartara Prapancha, Sriman Maha Bhartara Prapancha Mahiyas, or elliptical expressions like Mahatman, Mahadhi. So we can understand that his authority was universally acknowledged within the Vedanta school. Indeed, from Sureshwaracharya's vantage point, Bhartaprapancha was a thinker of comparable eminence to Shankaracharya himself. The only thing we know for sure is that he must have lived before Shankaracharya, that he authored a commentary on Brihadaranyukopanishad. Anandagiri reports that Bhartaprapancha composed his commentary on the Madhyandini Shakha, and his commentary was larger in extent than Shankaracharya's commentary on the Kanva recension. According to Gopala Yogin, a 17th century commentator who wrote a commentary on Shankaracharya Upanishad, he mentions that there is a commentary of Bhartaprapancha on Kathopanishad as well, but this is not corroborated anywhere. We do not know. Anandagiri is a statement made by Anandagiri which suggests that Bhartaprapancha might have written a commentary on Ishopanishad. Again, no other corroborating evidence, we don't know. But from all of these accounts, it is possible to establish a pretty accurate picture of Bhartaprapancha's philosophical views. He was a Bheda-Bheda-Vadan. We will briefly look into three most important divergences between Bhartaprapancha's and Shankara's position: the Bheda-Bheda-Vada, the Samuchchaya-Vada, and the Parinama-Vada. The Bheda-Bheda-Vada. Bhartaprapancha posited that the absolute is both dualistic and non-dualistic. He rejected the notion that it is purely one or the other. He argued that if absolute were purely non-dualistic, all duality would become illusory, like a mirage. This would render the ritualistic section of the Veda useless. The Karmakanda would become absolutely useless, as would the descriptions of origination, maintenance, dissolution of the world. The practical injunctions of Shravana Manana would become useless. On the other hand, if duality is considered completely real as it appears, then the philosophy of non-duality, which is taught in the Upanishads, would become false. So for Bhartaprapancha, the essence of Brahman is at the same time dual and non-dual. Dvaitadvaitatmaka. Following this, the nature of relationship between Jiva and Brahman, according to Bhartaprapancha, is Bheda-Bheda. Since Brahman is the self of all things, nothing can be essentially different from Brahman. This is the reason for the Abheda in the phrase Bheda-Bheda. And the reason for the Bheda is our daily perception. We see many different things in the world. We see selves. Another point is the Parinamavada. According to Bhartaprapancha, Brahman evolves into the phenomenal world through 8 gradual states or steps. The process of Prapancha is one of parinama or development, or rather evolution. It is the nature of Paramatman to develop as it develops into curves. And because of his omniscience and omnipotence, he may be said to develop himself by his own will. So accordingly, the absolute in its highest form is called Akshara. Then it fractionally begins to transform its first stage of transformation, of movement. Ishat Prachalitavastha is called Antaryamin. Next, when completely in motion, it is called Kshetrajna. These are the first 3 states. Iti Tisrovasthaha. Then there are 5 other states: the individual bodies, the Pinda, the types, the Jati, cosmic body, Virat, the cosmic soul, Sutra, and the cosmic powers, Daiva. So according to Bhartaprapancha, the absolute has 8 conditions, the avastha, and in this way, everything in the world, both the gross and the subtle, the living and the lifeless, is a development of Brahman. The Samuchchayavada is the doctrine of Samuchchaya, combination of karma and jnana. The premise that both karma and jnana are necessary to attain moksha. This is the position of Bhartaprapancha. Here, karma is not action in general. It refers to rituals, yajna, the Vaidika karma, that which is enjoined in the Vedas. And jnana is not knowledge, but it is meditation, it is upasana. Bhartara Prapancha Jnana Shabdasya Upasana Shabdartham Angi Kurvana Jnana Karma Samuchayam Moksha Sadhanam Manyante. His fragments reads Jnana Karma Samuchaya Sadhya Dvaita it's not Dvaita Dvaita, it's Dvaitha. So liberation is achieved through a combined path of upasana and ritual action. Shankaracharya condemns this very critically. For him, action cannot produce knowledge. He teaches that liberation is achieved through knowledge alone. Why? Because Brahman is Nitya Siddha, Nityapta. Moksha is already achieved. How can action contribute to it? Swami writes, notwithstanding, true liberation cannot be subject to any such classifications. In its authentic essence, liberation has already been attained. There is no variance in knowledge through which it is realized. Liberation is not a product of production, transformation, acquisition, or purification. Thus, it is not something that can be achieved, nor can it vary according to the means by which it is achieved. It is the very nature of the self, which has already been realized. Now, there are many academicians like Nakamura, Paul Hacker, and Rijenic who argue that the original metaphysical standpoint of Brahma Sutra is some kind of early Bheda Bhedavada. They arrive at this conclusion from the Brahma Sutra, Amsho Nana Vyapadeshat Anyatha Chape Dashakita Vaditvam Adhiyate. I forget the sutra exactly. It is stated that the Jiva is part of Brahman on account of the Upanishadic declarations of differences. They use this sutra. Then they point to other sutras like Phalamata Upapattehe, where the relation between Brahma and Jiva is described as the relation between the snake and its coil, light and its source. Since the source of light is essentially different from light, there exists a difference. But since both are luminous, they are identical. So Nakamura concludes with the remark that the standpoint of Bheda Bhedavada is a synthetic, eclectic theory whose aim is reconciliation of the passages in Upanishads, which advocate difference and non-difference. So scholars like this, they conclude that the Brahma Sutra assumes a Bheda metaphysical standpoint, which would reconcile all of the diverse passages about Brahman and the Jivatma in the Upanishads. Swami takes a radically different standpoint. He argues that the contradictory passages can be reconciled through the correct application of the method of Adhyaropapavada. We will come to this in the later session. So much about Bheda. Other strand of Vedanta Shankaracharya refutes in the Pancharatra is the Pancham or the Bhagavatas. This primarily occurs in the Sutra 2.2.42 to 45, the Utpatya Sambhavat Adhikarana. While explaining the first sutra of this Adhikarana, Utpatya Sambhavat, Shankaracharya gives the doxography of the Pancharatra system, which he is refute in the following sutras. I have typed all of this in, as in there's transliteration of the sutras, so it's not easy for me to read without the Devanagari script. I'm stumbling. But Tatra Bhagavata Manyate Bhagavane Vaiko Vasudevo Niranjana Jnanaswarupaha Paramarthatvam Sa Chaturdhatmanam Pravibhajya Pratishtitaha. See, the divine, the one Vasudeva, whose proper form is pure knowledge, is reality in the highest sense. He exists having differentiated himself in a fourfold way. Chaturdhatmanam Pravivajya Pratishtitaha, in the form of Vasudeva Vyuha. Vasudeva Vyuha Rupena, Sankarshana Vyuha Rupena, Pradyumna Vyuha Rupena, Aniruddha Vyuha Rupena. These are the four divisions of Vasa. The Sarshana is the Jiva, Pradyumna is the Manas, Aniruddha is Ahankara, and of these Vasudeva is Paraprakriti, Others, starting from Sankarsha, are the effects, and having worshipped this divine in these forms throughout one's life, one reaches that divine venerated one after the kleshas have disappeared. This is the Bhagavata position. Ramanujacharya and Vishishtadvaitins today claim that they belong to this tradition of the Bhagavatas. But the important thing to note here is that the Bhagavatas here espouse Jiva Brahmaikya in liberation. Atranudita Bhagavataha Muktau Jiva Brahmanor Abhedam Svikurvana. Brahmana Utpanno Jivaha Utpannas Upasanena Bhagavat Swarupatvam eva Pratipatyata iti Bruvanaha. So Swami writes, Yadyapi idanim Ramanujiyaha Anandatirthayascha Prahuhu Vayam Pancharatraanusarino Bhagavata eva iti Tathapi Bhagavatpada Bhashya Prakatana Kale Ye Bhagavatena Prasiddhaha Te Advaitina eveti Gamyate. Another Purvapaksha that Shankaracharya refutes, Prasankhyanavada. The 18th chapter of the Upadesha Sahasri is primarily concerned with refuting the Prasankhyanavada. What is Prasankhyanavada? Let me quote Sureshwaracharya's Naishkarmya Siddhi. Vedanta Vakya Janitam Aham Brahma iti Vijnanam Samsargatmakatvat Atmavastu Yathatmyavagahyeva na bhavati Kintarhi Etadeva Gangasrotovat Satatam Abhyasyato Anyadeva Avarthatmakam Vijnanantaram Utpadyate. The Vedanta Vakya Aham Brahmasmi does not result in direct knowledge of Brahma. But by this being meditated upon day by day for a long time, like Ganga Srotas, this will result in a direct experience of Brahma. This is the Prasankhana Vada, which advocates that not the Vedanta Vakya itself, but the repetition of Vedanta Vakya is the means of liberation. A great proponent of this Prasankhana Vada is Mandana Mishra. We will briefly look into his arguments for a representation of this philosophy. Jatepi Tattvadarshane Anahite Padya Sanskare Dhridiyasi cha Mithyadarshana Sanskare Nishchaya api Mithyartha bhavanti. Even when the knowledge of truth has dawned, but a sufficiently strong impression of it has been stored up, while the impression of false knowledge is stronger, then even the correct notions may present. If you're, for example, you are headed in the wrong direction and you find out the right direction, but still you can get lost. What Mandana says is that Shruti is the means of knowledge. It is a true pramana. If we are lost and unsure of which way is north or south, a competent authority can tell us the truth, reveal the correct direction. Similarly, when we from Shruti, our mistaken notion cease and we find the true direction. But in addition to this, Mandana says when we come to know the truth from Shruti and our avidya ceases, that avidya nonetheless can be seen to persist. Why? Because he says that knowledge gained from Shruti is merely theoretical. It is conceptual. It is not direct knowledge. Even after finding out the correct direction, a person may still get lost. He will continue to see two moons even after being told that there is only one moon. Why should error continue even when having learnt the truth? Mandana says it is because of the previous erroneous mental impressions that are stronger than the impressions generated by the Shruti. The karma vasana that have been strengthened by habitual repetition in the mind over a long period of time, they really tend to overwhelm the new impression generated by hearing the truth. The result, that when you know the truth, the error is seen to persist. What is the remedy for this? According to Mandana, the remedy is to make the new impression, generate stronger vasana of truth, make it stronger than the erroneous impressions. Just as erroneous impressions became firmly embedded through habituation or repeatedly meditated upon to the firmly established so that it can overwhelm the erroneous impressions. So according to Mandana, the knowledge needs to be reinforced by repetition. He denies that the words of Shruti can themselves bring about liberation unaided by repetition. When we come to the 18th chapter of Shankaracharya's Upadesha Sahasri, we see that he argues at considerable length position. He says that the Prasankhyanavad has misunderstood the Upanishads. Upanishads do not enjoin the individual to perform an action in order to achieve some end. On the contrary, the Upanishads culminate in the negation of superimposition in order to reveal the evident Atman. When the superimposition is removed, the Atman stands revealed and the nature is self-evident. There is nothing to be done. So the primary function ignorance, not teach Brahman, theoretical information about Brahman. We'll ask this later in the third class. But unfortunately, even after Shankaracharya's staunch refutation, Vachaspati Mishra very closely followed footsteps of Mandana. For him, Nididhyasana is a type of continuous meditation and based on the knowledge obtained via Shravana and Manana. Tatvavadhana तादृशो यद् आदिमपि निरूढ निबिड वासनम् अपि मिथ्याप्रत्यय. Please forgive my pronunciations. It's all written in English and it's very difficult for me to read it out. The very nature of the repetition of a certain knowledge is such that it removes even the beginningless false idea whose deep impression is deep-rooted. This is very much a deviation from Shankaracharya and Sureshwaracharya's positions, yet it is claimed as a commentary of Shankara's position. So what we see here are so many different strands of Vedanta. What Swami wants to demonstrate is the unequivocal absence, the conspicuous lack of any Dvaita interpretation of the Upanishad at the time of, just a second, at the time of Shankaracharya. So that Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita, Madhva's Dvaita interpretation of the Upanishads come later, after Shankaracharya. Ramanujacharya is dated to approximately 11th, 12th century. Madhvacharya is dated to 13th century, much later than Shankaracharya. At the time of Shankaracharya and prior to him, there was no Dvaita interpretation of the Upanishads. Dvaita schools existed. See, Dvaita in this context simply refers to any philosophy that does not allow Jiva Brahmaikya. Any philosophy that maintains absolute distinction of Jiva and Paramatman, these schools are called as Dvaita philosophical school. At the time of Shankaracharya, prior to him, Dvaita schools existed, like Sankhya, for example, Patas, Vaisheshikas, Jainas, but they did not call themselves Upanishad Darshanas. They did not claim that they're interpreting the Upanishads, the Vedanta. In fact, they're barely Astika Darshanas. They pay lip service to Shabda Pramana, if that, but certainly no more than that. Kumarila Bhatta criticizes them for this lip service paid to the Vedas. In turn, the Sankhya philosophers also faulted the Vedantins and Mimamsakas for their uncritical acceptance of Vedic authority. The Dvaita philosophy existed at the time of Shankara, and prior to him, they did not claim to be the philosophy of Upanishads. The philosophy of the Upanishads was unequivocally Jiva Brahmaikya. The Upanishads proclaim the absolute unity of Jiva and Brahman. This was beyond question. How do we know this? Swami establishes this based on two critical factors. The absolute lack of any mention of Dvaita interpretation of Upanishads in Shankara Bhashya. This we saw in the class today. In his commentary, Shankaracharya in his philosophical discourse rebuts the dualistic ideologies of Sankhya, other schools of philosophy, does not mention
dualistic Vedanta systems. Even the Sankhya philosophers themselves examine only the non-dual Vedantic teachings in their own texts, not the dualistic Vedanta teachings. So the scarcity, the absolute paucity of mention of these systems in Bhagavad-pada's commentaries serves as evidence for their absolute absence during his time. At his prior to him, there was no dualistic Vedanta teachings. The second evidence for this is the explicit pronoun of Shankaracharya regarding universally accepted nature of the Upanishadic teaching as Jiva Brahmaikya. He says as much in so many words that the Upanishads teach the idea of unity or identity of Jiva and Paramatman. This is an undisputed understanding of the adherents of Upanishads. So Swami establishes through Anvaya Vyatireka that there is no Dvaita interpretation of the Upanishads at the time of Shankaracharya or prior to him. This is the first point that Swami addresses. To summarize, Vedantic schools that precede Shankaracharya and Badarayana were unanimous in their belief that there is no ultimate distinction between Jiva and Brahman. Upanishads proclaimed Jiva Brahmaikya as a central tenet. However, the later schools of Vishishtadvaita that emerged after Shankara rejected the idea of Jiva Brahmaikya, instead asserted a fundamental difference between individual self and ultimate reality. And as we saw, these schools have no direct precursors in the pre-Shankara Vedantic tradition. Their emergence represents a significant deviation from the earlier Vedantic consensus. So in conclusion, the Vedanta Darshana before Shankaracharya, before Badarayana, was defined by a consensus on the concept of Jiva Brahmaikya and the notion that liberation is achieved through knowledge, jnana, realization of this identity. This is the gist of the first chapter. We'll look into the next chapter tomorrow. Thank you very much.